Good morning. Thank you very, very much for coming out to this presentation. My name is Bill Wright. I'm the technical manager for a company called Stone Tile International. I'm also one of the directors of the Trouser Tile and Marble Association of Canada. Today we're going to talk a little bit about specifying, selecting tile and stone. We'll have some time for some questions afterwards, and if you could please come up and use the microphone in the center, that would be appreciated. They're filming the series for post in the future. Thank you. Many of the sponsors for today we give our thanks to, including the Trouser Tile and Marble Association and everybody else that we see here. How to specify, design, and install tile and stone to avoid failures. A little bit of my job involves answering the phone when it rings for people that have had an issue or they've had a problem. So a lot of what you're going to see today is coming out of my frustration, because I understand, if there were a couple of simple things that would have been done beforehand or thought of, we wouldn't be end up with somebody that was, had a failure. Nobody likes a failure. And so some of this is my venting, but please follow along, and I think we'll have some fun. So we've come a long way from the way we were. The old days, father and son, pick and shovel. You'd send a letter to Europe to order your tile, and a couple months later you get a letter back, and it would take a while to get things. And now things are very, very much immediate. Things are changing very, very rapidly. New materials, new processes, new methods. Okay. Dale was talking earlier about the TTMAC. We have a manual called the 09300 Tile and Stone Installation Manual. It's pretty much the Bible for the tile and stone industry for installation. It clearly outlines all the responsibilities of the installer, the manufacturer, the suppliers, and the spec writers for success. This is some of the people that go into putting the manual together, from across North America. How do failures happen? This was a large format porcelain tile, 1 meter by 3 meter, on a concrete. And it started failing quite quickly into the installation. I get called to the job site. I start talking to the contractor. He ensures me that the mortar was spread properly on the substrate, that the mortar was spread properly on the back butter, on the back side of the big porcelain panel, and it failed. And he lied. When we pulled up the panel, we saw that he just put down donuts or dots or blobs of mortar. And that's not the proper way to do this. So because it wasn't installed properly, you're looking somewhere in the neighborhood of between $80,000 and $100,000 failure that could have easily been avoided if they'd followed the proper procedures to install things. What's a failure? You think you have all the right parts to put things together, and still we have a failure. Okay. As I said, the manual outlines everybody's responsibility for success. Okay. Most common errors: improper material selection, improper material specification, insufficient knowledge, untested or improper installation methods, and poor substitution choices seem to be the most common errors. Okay. These are two different projects. The first one on your left was an exotic slate floor in a high traffic entryway to a store in downtown Toronto. It wasn't the right selection for wasn't the right material to select for something that high traffic. In a few short years, the stone wore out straight through to the mortar. If there'd been some better communication, we would have suggested they use something else. The other one on the right. This was a thin profile glass tile used on a floor for a bicycle exercise franchise. They have the special shoes with the metal horseshoes on it, and the metal horseshoes just tore through the glass tile. Again, if we had some better communication between what was going on, we wouldn't have had that issue. Okay. There's lots of different materials out there to select. Many different materials. Things to consider when you're selecting material. The expected traffic. The slip resistance that they need. The expected longevity. The nice things about tiles and stones, they're designed, installed properly, they'll last 100 years or better. The suitability of the material given the substrate tolerances and the maintenance concerns. It's very important that there's a discussion about maintenance. Some finishes, rougher finishes, require more maintenance than others. Many people are just geared up for a mop-type maintenance program, and some of these heavily distressed finishes, although attractive, are not something that you can mop easily and maintain. Material selections, like I said, stones and tiles can vary. It's very important that you see a big representative selection of the material that you're choosing to appreciate the various shades that may be available. This is an example of the variation charts for tile, from on the left to almost nothing to something very dramatic on the right. And again, these things are important to have a look at. We've had them where they've picked an entire floor based on a 4x4 sample, and you can't appreciate the variety of the patterns and the looks that are going to come. So make sure you see enough of the material to appreciate the variation that you're going to get. This is an example of a stone called Calcutta. Pardon me. These are both Calcutta, and you can see the dramatic difference between the two. If you were expecting one and got the other, you may not be too pleased with what you got. So again, this goes back to the discussion about seeing enough of the samples to appreciate what you're getting. Natural stones are going to have natural markings. Limestones are old seabeds. You're going to get fossils in them. It's going to be an inherent quality of the stone. Some materials will have epoxy fill in them. Again, this is something that you need to be made aware of. Also, look at the edges. Especially in both tile and stone, we can get tile that's rectified. We can get tile that's unrectified. We can get mitered edges in both tile and stone. These are things to consider because this will dictate what type of grout joint that you have to use. Manufactured tiles are getting bigger and bigger. They tend to, the specifiers and the designers and the architect tend to like the tighter joints, things around 2 or 3 millimeter, which is achievable, but we have to make sure that we have a good flat substrate to start with. And we have to make sure we have a good installer to install the materials. You're talking flatness in the terms of about 3 millimeters across 3 meters, a very flat installation floor for large format tiles. And this applies for both walls and floors, a good flat installation. Special mortars are required for large format tiles and stones. For tiles, when you get a big tile, traditional mortars have very high water content. And if the air can't get in to dry out that mortar because of the size of the tile, it's never going to dry or cure properly. So the industry's worked very hard to come out with proper mortars, self-curing mortars that don't have to release any extra moisture to cure properly. So make sure that when you're specifying a whole system, that you have the input of the supplier or the mortar manufacturer onto what the best mortar selections are to use. There's always going to be some preparation. The best thing the cement guys can do for a flat floor is about 6 millimeters in 3 meters. And as I said earlier, we need somewhere between 2 and 3 millimeters. So that you already see that there's going to be an issue in terms of how flat we can get the concrete guy can get the floor. So there's going to be some type of prep always required to make sure that things are flat enough to install tile. What happens if we don't have the proper prep is we end up with situations like that first slide where the installer decided to use blobs or dabs of mortar to level the floor out. But as I said in the picture, it fails miserably. So it's very important that both as a specifier and as an installer that there's proper preparation to make sure things are flat enough to install tile. Now, manufactured tile is going to have or can have a little bit of a bow in it. It's deliberate. Once we get into a big, large format tile, we can't make a perfectly flat floor, flat tile. The tile industry generally uses production equipment from one of two companies, very similar production methods, so it doesn't matter where in the world you're buying the tile. Anybody manufacturing tile, there's a good possibility there's a little bit of a bow in it. And like I said, it's deliberate because we can't make anything flat. We put a little bit of a bow on it because the alternative would be a little bit of a sag, which would be even more difficult to deal with. So just because there's a little bit of a bow doesn't mean the tile's defective or sub-quality. It's inherently built into the manufacturing process for the tile. Okay. If you're here earlier, Dale was talking a lot about lead. I'm not going to go through all these points. It was covered pretty well in the last seminar. But just understand that both tile and stone are very much VOC free. They have the lowest carbon footprint of any flooring material available out there. Many of the manufacturers have health product declaration forms and environmental declaration forms on how things are being manufactured and what goes into it. The nice thing about both tile and stone, especially in light colors, your light reflective value never changes. So when you use lighter colors inside, they never change. It always keeps that same bright reflective finish, either in tile or stone. Okay. Leeds made great strides in the last couple of years to be a lot more inclusive of tile and stone. And as Dale mentioned, like I said in the earlier presentation, you can have a look at that. I'm not going to go through that. Most of you were here earlier for the same presentation. ASTM standards and ISO standards. We have standards for pretty much everything. You know, all the tiles, all the stones. There's specific standards that manufacturers have to manufacture to. These test data should be available from your suppliers or from the manufacturers for your review. If you don't understand it, please speak to whoever you're specifying and make sure that they can explain the information for you for your better understanding. It's a great way to keep everybody on an even keel in terms of what you're getting. You know, just because two things look the same doesn't necessarily mean they are the same. But if we can get into the finer details of the test data, it's easier to see how similar or dissimilar materials are. These are the American test standards. We've got the international test standards again, the ISO standards. We've adopted a lot of the ISO standards here in Canada. We used to use the CGSB spec from 1988. It was well out of date. It was so out of date that it didn't even have a category for porcelain tile. The TTMAC asked the CGSB to update it, and we were encouraged to donate a fair amount of money for that conversion, and decided that as the world seemed to be going to ISO, we'll just happily keep our money for other more important educational endeavors and adopt ISO. So that's why we're using the ISO standards now. Slip resistance. Nobody likes to go, oops, it hurts. We've had a big change with the slip resistance measurements in the last couple of years. We've gone from a static coefficient of friction to a dynamic coefficient of friction. We've now got a computer. Everything was very manual before, so it allowed a lot of leeway in terms of the results. Now we've got a calibrated robot that's portable. We can take it off site and check the slip resistance. Generally, we're looking for minimum pass of better than 0.42, and for ramps and inclines, we're looking for better than 4.5. This applies to hardwood, tile, stone, any hard surface is now covered under ANSI A137.1. I know a lot of manufacturers can get you this test data. A lot of people put it on their sample boards. There is no correlation between this and the previous test method. There is no relation. This machine more emulates how people actually walk, and we're finding much better results with it. Material specifications. Generally, specifications are written to meet a minimum standard. Like I said earlier, it's important that when we're specifying materials that we look at the number of samples that are being looked at. We look at all the technical data for things that are being specified. We want to know what the edges look like. These things need to be looked at. Color consistency are very, very important issues to look at when you're specifying material or getting an appreciation of when you're specifying material. Large format tiles, or tiles in general. We talked about rectified versus non-rectified edges. These large tiles with rectified edges, we want 2-3 millimeter joints. Unrectified tiles can vary plus or minus 2 millimeters, so you're going to end up with much wider joints. So it's important to understand, if you're looking for a thin joint, you can't use an unrectified tile, you can't get it. We've had people, and they're generally less expensive than rectified materials, both to manufacture and to install. And we've had people buy unrectified tile, and the specifier demand that they have are 1 or 2 millimeter joint. And like I said, if the tile varies plus or minus, 2 or 3 millimeters, all of a sudden you've got tiles with no joints and tiles butting and banging into each other, and it just can't be achieved. So it's important to understand, the types of edging that you get. The minimum size joint we can have is 1.6. Please don't go to these super tight 1 millimeter joints. We just can't get the grout in there to fill those joints. Certainly for tile, we don't like any big rectangular tile with a 50-50 offset. Like I said, we spoke about the bow. The high part is in the middle, the low part is at the edge. When we have a 50-50 offset, you have the two biggest variances right beside each other, the middle and the end. If we slide that over to like a 30-70 type of offset, the joint is much more even. We don't seem to see as much lippage. Those are, again, when you're specifying a pattern, keep those types of things in mind. If the tile does vary, more than 1.5 millimeters, like unrectified tiles do, like I said, you're going to have to go to a wider joint, 4-5 millimeters wide. Okay. Now we have super large format porcelain tiles. These require a lot more prepping, a lot more care taken in terms of the flatness. Many of the manufacturers of these types of panels have installation recommendations. Get them from your suppliers and include them in your specifications so that there's information available to the installer to make sure that he has the proper types of trowels. We want a different type of trowel than traditionally used. We want different types of mortars than traditionally used. So get the manufacturer's installation instructions and certainly pass those on in your specification. Okay. Now we're getting into exterior cladding. We talked about exterior cladding for stone this morning, and it's another big opportunity for tile and stone being used. There's several engineering companies here in the city that have great experience with exterior cladding. The nice thing about porcelain tile is all the inherent benefits of it being, color, color fast, heat resistant, very easy to maintain, never changes its appearance. Wonderful materials for exterior claddings. Large format tiles, like I said, we're getting into 20 by 20 or 120 by 120s, 90 by 90s. These require a very, very skilled set of installers to install. They are out there. When we're doing these types of materials, it's important to consider the patterns. We want to try and eliminate wastage. If you need some help on that, most of the manufacturers are more than willing to sit down and try and show you how to best maximize the size of the pieces that you're using. We're getting even into 12 millimeter porcelain slabs now for countertops, interiors and exteriors. Again, the same practical benefits for porcelain tile in terms of its impact resistance, its scratch resistance, things like that. Natural stone. When we're specifying natural stone, it's really important to add many things into the specification: the name of the stone, the finish of the stone, the supplier name and a contact name, so that whoever's bidding the job can know who to speak to, the size of the tile, the thickness. These are important things. Understanding that the tiles can vary, or natural stones can vary plus or minus 5 millimeters. So those things have to be taken into consideration. Again, we talked earlier about the shade variation, the natural markings. We want to make sure that there are no fissures, there are no cracks. We don't want any big marks or spots. If these things are naturally inherent in the stone, they need to be looked at, like I said, in a large range, and at least put in the specification or have control samples available so that people know what to get. We had an issue at my company that somebody wanted a very nice white stone with a little bit of veining, but it can come with some pretty dramatic veining as well. And they dropped off a sample, and the architect loved the sample. It was the best sample that somebody could have created, and submitted it, and lo and behold, it was approved. And it was shown to the owners. Everybody liked it. It was given to the tile contractor as a control sample, and they ordered Bill Wright white, and it came more to the dramatic side than the very, very understated side. That sample that was the control sample around was communicated to everybody except us, so that we didn't know what to order. We assumed it was a generic type of recommendation anyway. It wasn't a complete failure. It was just a little bit of a delay to get things done. But if there'd been a little better communication in terms of sampling, I'm a big fan now of making sure that everybody gets a copy of a sample. Us as a supplier, the specifier, the installer, so that everybody's got the same sample. We know what to get. There aren't any surprises. Okay. I generally like to have everything signed and approved, so there's no surprises after the fact. There's lots of different stone varieties out there. Lots of different textures, more and more textures all the time, like we were talking about. When we get into to stones on walls and large format tiles, we prefer cement type or cement board types of materials than drywall. We want things that are nice and stiff. We've had issues where they've used traditional gypsum drywall for big, large format tiles, and the walls are just too flimsy. Things either crack or they break. So we would generally, when we get into these bigger, larger materials, we want cement or cement board types of assemblies to install tile or stone onto. Generally, you're looking somewhere in the neighborhood of a deflection of about an L over 720, a very good stiff substrate. Okay. When we get to stones, again, speak with the specifiers, but it's a good idea to have materials sealed before they're installed. Sometimes just the oils from your hands from the installer can leave marks on the stones, especially light-colored stones or dark-colored stones. And people don't think of those things. Be careful when you're mixing stones of different varieties, understanding that they need to be maintained differently, or they can need to be maintained differently. They can wear differently over time. Again, things to consider when we're specifying tile. These are just an example of some of the different trim profiles out there to make things nice and clean. Generally, we don't want saw cuts and things like that for expansion joints. They tend to wander a little bit and look a little rough. So there's a variety of different trim profiles out there to make the jobs and corners and stairs and things like that look a little nicer, whether it's baseboards, walls or floors, things like that. So these are other little pieces that can really make the job look a little nicer. There's nothing worse than seeing an outside corner done by hand, or badly done by hand, and have it wander up the wall. So these little trims can come off making things look really, really nice. Some profiles have a much thinner little look to it. They're not as obvious as some of the others. Give those things a consideration. Lack of expansion planning. That's one of the biggest issues we have with tile and with stone is expansion joints. It's often left up to the contractor, installer to decide where these go. The TTMAC manual outlines pretty clearly where they're supposed to go. Generally for interiors, they have to be 6 millimeters wide and spaced every 480 to 610 centimeters, roughly every 16 to 20 feet. And if it's in direct sunlight, somewhere between 240 to 270 centimeters or 7 to 12 feet. And these is for both for floors and walls. It's very, very important that we don't skate these things. We've had issues, especially when we get into herringbone patterns or chevron patterns or things like that, that they include the expansion joint. We've just made some changes to the manual to allow joints to be slightly offset or a zipper type of pattern rather than just always a straight line, so that we can accommodate some of these patterns. But to avoid them can cause a lot of issues. I had to go to a job site, one of the 30th floors of an office tower downtown. It was a herringbone pattern, no expansion joints. On a big windy day, the building moves pretty good, and in no short time there was some cracking and tiles breaking. And my first question to the contractor was, "Why didn't you put the expansion joints in?" And his response was, "The specifier didn't want them because it would interrupt the pattern." And we look at the floor, and I don't think that the owners were too happy with the way things were looking. So please don't skate these. And again, this equally as important on the outside of a building. It's really up to the engineering consultant or the architect to decide where these things are put in, but don't avoid them. This is another example of it cracking. I don't think the picture on the right you can see the crack very well, but it comes off the leg of the desk there, down almost through the center of the picture. It's a big long crack, and that again is a result of the improper use of expansion joints. Subfloors, we talked a fair bit about that already in terms of the floor flatness. Generally, we're using, either it's hollow core, pre-stressed or post-tension type of concrete assemblies. Again, all the same things apply in terms of the flatness. I told you the best cement guys in the city can get to about 6 millimeters in 3,000 millimeters, and we need 3. So again, back to preparation, we want good flat substrates. The issues we're finding now is there isn't a standard specification for prep, and when installers are bidding the job, this seems to be the area where they're very loose about. And if there isn't a proper allowance, the best thing you can put in the specification is an allowance for preparation. Talk to the mortar manufacturers, the prep manufacturers, have them to site, see what types of things they suggest that you're going to need to make the floor flat enough to use the material you've selected before the specification goes out, if you can, and they'll give you a price, whether it's going to be $1 a square foot or $2.50 a square foot for the materials to make the floor flat enough, and include that in your specification. When you leave it up to the discretion of the installer, that's when they're most apt to make decisions for shortcuts, going back to that whole blobbing of the mortar and things like that. So very, very important that we have some type of allowance, preferably per square foot, for preparation and specifications. If you're not too sure, is there a new type of assembly? We do have a Robinson's test where they'll take the same similar type of concrete that you have. They'll build an entire assembly with your waterproofing, your anti-fracture membrane, your mortar, your tile, your stone, and they'll run a test. They'll put a great big wheel on it, and after so many revolutions, they keep increasing the hardness of the wheels until it breaks. And depending on where it breaks, how many revolutions and what type of wheel material, it can reach up to an extra heavy-duty type of assembly. So if you're doing a big commercial project and you don't know, the cost to get the Robinson chest might be about $1,500, and it's certainly a worthwhile investment to have that assembly tested to make sure that all those parts are going to work together. I got called to a job site in Vancouver. We'd supplied some tile, and it was failing, or the assembly was failing. And I get there, and there's 6 different suppliers at the site meeting, and each one of us contributed one part to this entire assembly. And all of a sudden, the finger pointing started, and everybody's blaming everybody else, and this waterproofing wasn't suitable with that mortar. This anti-fracture membrane couldn't be used in this type of situation, and none of the parts work together. And I asked the question, how did we get to here without anybody checking? And the architects had spoken to a local contractor and got their recommendation. Unfortunately, that contractor didn't get the job. And I was very surprised that nobody had a warranted system to put all the parts together. So it's very important, when you're using multiple parts in a system, get a warranty. Make sure they're all going to work together. If you're not sure, ask them all. Most of these guys have pretty good information onto what parts work best together for success. Take advantage of the information. And if they don't have it, like I said, you can get a Robinson's floor test. And we can do that here, and the TTMAC can do that here in Toronto. Okay. We talked about floor flatness. I get a lot of questions about what's the best way for floor prep, what's the cheapest way to do it. For new construction, depressing the slab and using a mortar bed is pretty common. We've been doing it something similar to this with a 6 mil poly sheet beneath it, a slip sheet. The same type of method they used for cathedrals and buildings in Europe for 2,000 years. So that's the easiest way for new construction. Depress the slab, inch and a half, 2 inches, and then have the mortar bed. You're going to look at average cost, even if it's 2 or 3 inches thick, somewhere between $1 to $2 a square foot for labor and materials to make the floor flat enough for success. Retrofit, a little more difficult because we're working with existing conditions. There's self-levelers out there. They can go from nothing, a zero feather finish type of profile, up to usually about 12 mil over existing tile, old adhesives. Many things don't need to be ripped up. You can go right over top of them. They're good and solid. This is going to cost somewhere, again, for labor and materials, a little more expensive, about $3 a square foot, but you save a fair bit in terms of having to rip out, if you can go over top of existing things, say existing tile. You don't have the rip-out costs, but you might have a little more in terms of floor prep. Here's an example of them putting down some floor self-levelers. And a lot of these things dry either overnight or they dry, depending on how far you build it up, anywhere from a half an hour to a couple hours to do that. Often they'll do it the night before, so it has a chance to cure overnight without anybody walking on it, and start putting down the tile or the stones afterwards. Walls, the same thing. Like I said, we like cement or cement-based type products for walls. Otherwise, we like parging. Recently, I was called to a job. We'd supplied some limestone, be a little bit of a moisture-sensitive stone, and the phone call came that they had these big wet circles coming out on the stone. You can imagine that, the contractor decided not to prep the wall properly and blobbed the mortar on the back of the stone, and it was bleeding through. And the general contractor was quite adamant that that hadn't been the case. And I walked in, and the first thing I saw was they were installing the same mosaic over the same mosaic in a shower stall. So they had this white 1x1 in the shower, and they're putting another layer of it over top of it. And I thought, well, that was kind of strange. And then I go on to the site meeting, and sure enough, we see this leopard spot wall, and the general contractor was adamant that they hadn't spot bonded it, and I asked the contractor, did you spread the mortar on the wall? Yeah. And I said, and then you went back into your bucket because the wall was a little uneven and you threw 6 blobs on the back of the stone. And he says, yeah. And I looked at the general contractor and I said, I told you. I said, why didn't you parge the wall flat first so that you didn't have to, cheat or try and cheat and use the spot bond method? And his question to me was, what was parging? He'd never heard of parging before, so I was a little astounded and explained to him what it involved. And we dismissed the tile contractor, and I'm just standing there with the general contractor. And I said, what was the story with the mosaics? When I just walked in, why are you putting the same thing down twice? He said, well, the first time they installed it, they didn't slope it to the drain properly, so they had to redo it. I said, I'm not trying to be funny here, but I really got to ask you the question. At what point is the red light going off that this might not be the best guy for this job? And he said, yeah, I know, but, he was the lowest price. And sure enough, within a year, I got a phone call to try and write a letter about my job site visit so that, he could take them to court. It was becoming a great big mess because things weren't done properly. So, again, follow the methods in the installation manual. Parge the wall. Okay. Setting materials. We generally like rapid settings or white setting materials for stones. They tend to be light-colored limestones and marbles can sometimes telegraph the darker mortars. There seems to be an idea out there that any mortar is good enough. I've got guys that have they all start off by saying they've been in the industry for 30 years, and they're using the same mortar for a tile that's a meter by a meter as a tile that they used for a 30 by 30 or a 12 by 12 15 years ago. Well, that product was never engineered, to cure properly under a tile that big or to support that heavy a weight. So it's really important that we use the proper setting materials for the proper use. And mortar manufacturers have gotten very, very smart. Years ago there was one option, and now there are literally hundreds of different types of mortars for different applications, from glass to stone to tile to large format tile. Get the input of the either the specifier, the product you're using, or the individual mortar manufacturers to what's best to use. We want, like I said, fast setting tiles, fast setting mortars for stone. different mortars for exteriors and for exteriors. So have these conversations. Make sure this is something on your checklist when you're writing a specification. Have we spoke to the manufacturer or the supplier and got their guidelines on what mortar, what types of mortars to best use? We move on to things like mortars and underlayments, waterproofing membranes. There's many different types of options out there. There's probably a couple distributors here showing the materials here. Sometimes they're sheets, sometimes they're roller applied almost like a paint. There's crack isolation membranes. Some get actually mortared to the floor, some are free floating. We've now got bonded sound reduction membranes, sound control underlayments, vapor retardant membranes, and these are all great products, but sometimes you can't use them under a thin tile, or you can't use them under a particular type of stone. Have these discussions with, again, the specifiers or the individual manufacturers to make sure what things go together. I know if you call my company or any of my competitors, they'll happily give you the proper recommendations they have for a system to install the product, because we want you to succeed. Okay. This is just a couple of examples. Like I said, waterproofing membranes. Some are sheet goods, some are roller applied, anti-fracture membranes. Some can go over top of existing tiles. Some get bonded. When you get into larger tiles and stones, it's always a good idea to have some type of anti-fracture membrane to allow for some movement. Sound membranes. Usually, quite commonly, we'll see something made of a recycled type of tire appearance, multicolor. Seems to be the most popular thing out there. You see a lot of this used in condominium types of projects. A lot of them have very, very low profiles, so they don't add a lot of great height to the floor assembly. There are standards for them to meet. ANSI A118.3. Most of the brochures will give you an idea of what their ICC rating is in terms of their transmission of sound. Things to consider. Okay. Tile levelers, these have become very, very prevalent in the last few years as we get into larger and larger tiles. They're great little pieces. Sometimes it's a shim through a slot. Sometimes it's something like this that's screwed down or a snap. And all that does is make a very slight adjustment, and we're talking less than a half a millimeter from tile to tile, so there's a smoother transition across the joint. I've seen projects where, the first couple 100 feet were done without it, and a big, long, skinny tile, something very, very big, long, wood-looking type of tile, and it was a little bit of lippage, a little bit of walking along the joints. Once they started using something like this, a whole different story. It looked like a completely different installer was doing the job. Nice and flat, even transitions across the joint. We get into things like lighting. I get more calls from installers after the fact that they were surprised by the look of things. You didn't pick it in the dark, don't install it in the dark. It's important to keep lighting back at least 2 feet from the wall, 610 millimeters. Otherwise, you have a very, very steep angle in terms of the light. It telegraphs any imperfection or undulation in the wall. Keep it back. I know when we get into things like mock-ups, the guy had one job here. What happened? The guy had one job, and he put hamburger buns and hot dog bun bags. Get a mock-up. The nice thing about a mock-up, include the lighting in the mock-up. It's an opportunity for everybody to evaluate how things are going to work together, including the contractor's experience. Put the lighting in it. The best thing to do is to get an overall perspective of how things are going to look. It avoids the surprises. Mock-ups are certainly the best way to try and avoid any surprises or failures ahead of time. again, and even the smallest of projects can benefit with the use of that. Insufficient knowledge. These are a series of pictures of some failures. You saw the one on the right already with the crack down it. The one on the left, there were two things going on there. First off, the contractor blobbed the mortar on the back of the wall, and there were big pieces of stone put over top of drywall. And at the far left of that picture is a sliding door that comes across to close it off at night. And they must just be ramming that door into that drywall wall over with the stone on top of it at night, because it started cracking all the way up and down the wall because the wall was moving, because I said it was on drywall rather than on cement boards. Okay. Again, this was probably one of the worst jobs I went to. This was a job up at York University. Some of the tiles were broken on site. So rather than talk to the general contractor, to the client, York University, but maybe adjusting the pattern because it was supposed to be full pieces all the way up, the contractor went ahead and installed the material. It doesn't help that the lighting's right at the top of the page, but that chip out of the tile is as big as my finger. It's a huge chip missing from the tile. How he thought anybody was going to miss it was a mystery to me. I don't know how he thought it wouldn't be noticed. The excuse I got was that, the bathroom had to be open for the beginning of school of September. And it was, for about 4 days before they had to close it down again and rip out all the tile and redo it. Okay. We're talking about back buttering. This is back buttering when we apply either the tooth trowel marks or just the flat side of the trowel to the back of the tile. We're looking for improved coverage and adhesion somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 to 95%. And the best way to achieve that is with back buttering. Specified back buttering in the specification. Okay. We're talking about improper installation materials. Again, you can see that somebody thought it was a good idea not to make the floor nice and flat and decided to throw down some blobs. The one on the left there was a rather expensive swimming pool, and they bought a good tile, they bought a good mortar. I got a call from the owner that the tile guy, as soon as he puts it up, the tile's falling off the wall. All you have to do is touch it, and it seems to be falling from the wall. It's not adhering very well. So I told him I'd go and have a look. Now, I don't know if you can tell from the picture, but there's hardly any mortar up on that wall behind those tiles. Generally, we want them to use a 1/8 V-notch trowel. And I told that to the owner, and he said, well, that's what the guy's using. I said, well, can I see the trowel? And he actually had it, which these things never seem to happen, but he had the trowel, and he went and got it. And once upon a time, it was a wonderful 1/8 V-notch trowel. But it was so old, and the points were worn down that it was maybe leaving almost nothing on the wall. So again, a big failure. The material didn't stick because there wasn't enough material, there wasn't enough mortar left behind to stick the tile to, so it fell off the wall. The poor guy was desperate. I think he managed to find somebody to remount it to get it restalled. But you were talking, $30,000 worth of glass tile that was just going up and coming down because it wasn't being installed properly. The one on the right, we generally like to use either epoxy or sanded grouts for wet areas, especially behind mosaics of stone and glass. This is an installation with unsanded grout. And it wasn't sealed, so the moisture's getting in through the grout joints and discoloring the glass tile behind it. Okay. This is another example of the same type of thing, but on the floor. You can even see the mesh on the back of the mosaic telegraphing back through the tile. Okay. Surface preparation, you can see the lippage at the top there. On the bottom, this was a fire station out in Brampton. I got a call from the general contractor, and he said, things don't look right. And it was a large, thin porcelain tile or rectangular tile on the wall. And he said, it's all uneven. There's a lot of lippage. I said, is it over a block wall? He said, yeah. I said, did they parge the wall? And he said, no. I said, is the light right at the top of the wall? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, that's as good as it's going to get. And he said, well, you're not going to come to site and have a look? I said, well, I can come and have a look, but I'm telling you, pretty sure that, I hear this and I see this every day. I'm pretty sure I'm going to tell you exactly what you're seeing. Anyway, he was quite adamant, and I went to site, and sure enough, I came to site, and in 7 minutes, I basically told him exactly what I told him on the phone, and he still didn't believe me that this was it, and asked what he could do, and I suggested that he get an inspection from the Trousdale and Marble Association. It's pretty reasonable, and he did, and I never heard from him again. But I did happen to run into the inspector. I know who he is. A lot of these guys are old, retired tile guys, and I often called them to pick their brain, and I knew who the inspector was that did the inspection, and I saw him, and I asked him, did he go to the job site? And he said, yeah. Why? I said, what did you tell him? So he tells me, he says, why? I said, how much did they charge him? And he said, about $600. I said, okay, good. He says, are you going to tell me why? I said, because I told him the same information for free twice, and I want to make sure that he felt much better getting the same information, but for $600. So I'm glad somebody got paid to give him the information. Okay. Again, improper surface preparation, big custom home, nice part of town, Toronto, and that's probably close to 1 inch wide at the top of the wall there. Unacceptable. Parging, the difference between parging. Going back to my story about the guy, what's parging? Yeah. Okay. This, the one on the left was interior designer, well-known interior designer. She bought a beautiful stone, had it installed. They didn't do the waterproofing properly, and it bled up the wall and actually out through the wall into the bedroom next door. Because it wasn't done properly. The installation was about 2 years old. They had to strip off the bottom half of the wall and the floor, and as it turned out, she couldn't get the same shade of stone that she got 2 years old earlier. They started working in a different part of the quarry, so everything had to get ripped up and replaced in less than 2 years. Very, very unfortunate. The one on the right was very frustrating. This was, this is a well-known architect here in Toronto. They'd bought some mosaics, installed the mosaics, started cracking, started having some water issues, replaced it, same thing, started cracking, started having some water issues. I said, okay, there's something really going on here. So let's rip everything out right down to the rubber gasket, and pull the rubber gasket off, and this is what we see. We see 6 bags of sand still in the bag, with a couple bags of sand spread in between as the solid base for her shower. And people don't believe it, but that's really true. That was really, really done. And again, a prominent architect, supposedly good contractor. I don't know whether the supervision was missing, but these things are out there and they're happening. Inspecting the materials, the one on the left is a stone that varies. The installer didn't have any room on site to just scatter them together to have a nice even distribution, so he took them out of the skid and up in the wall, and you got lights on the bottoms and lights, darks, and mediums in the middle. The alternative was that he had to rip out a bunch on the bottom and the top and put in more mediums and darks. Okay. I'm getting the 5-minute sign here. It's just, you've seen, this is what happens. Just quickly, the one on the top left there, this was a big condominium project. The owners had the keys to move in, big thick stone, and the tile started falling off the walls 5 days before they were moving in because the contractor cheated. Okay. Same types of things. We talked about lippage, how to avoid it. You know, sometimes these are the site conditions we're seeing people in. Okay? Substitutions, make sure you know what you're getting. You know, just because they look the same, they may not be the same. Anyway, that's it for me. Thank you very, very much for coming out.